Here at the Lore Lodge, we like to open up our videos with a little joke. But, you know what? Go ahead, watch this video, and you tell me what you would have said. I'm Aiden Battis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. Panicked howling. That is what caught the attention of John Bachman, his wife, and their two elder children. It was early June in the isolated Tumbling Run Valley of eastern Pennsylvania, and 4 out of 5 members of the Bachman family were on a walk through the woods not far from their home, having left their yet unnamed 4-month-old infant daughter sleeping in her crib and in the care of their trusted guard dog. Fearing the worst, John rushed back to the house, where he found the door open and the baby nowhere to be found. The Bachmans immediately set about searching the property and the surrounding area, but as the hours dragged on into the night, it rapidly became clear that the child wasn't anywhere nearby. And while the door to their small rural home didn't have a lock, it did require opening a latch, making it unlikely that anything without thumbs could have gotten in without breaking down the door. Furthermore, there were no signs of the place being ransacked by wild animals, nor was there a trail of muddy wolf or cougar prints leading to the nursery. So, if something took the little girl, it seemed that it had to have been a person, but as Bachman looked around, that too seemed ever more unlikely. Nothing else of value had been taken from the home, and one would think that the dog should have been a deterrent to any would-be kidnapper. Yet here they stood, with the only signs of intrusion being a frightened dog and a missing infant. The next day, John went into the nearby town of Pottsville, where he informed the sheriff of Schuylkill County that somehow his youngest child had gone missing from within the home. The sheriff quickly organized a search effort, mostly made up of local residents, and they fanned off into the forests in search of the missing infant. This, too, sadly, failed to turn up any evidence, and to this day, nobody knows what happened. But people do have some ideas. One of those people is David Paulides, a former police officer, and since his retirement, one of the nation's leading Bigfoot researchers, who included the version of the story you just heard in Missing 411 Eastern United States, a collection of odd and/or unsolved missing persons cases primarily centered around North America's wildlands. And according to Paulides, just under 40 of those can be found in Pennsylvania alone, making it the largest single cluster of missing children in the United States or Canada, which happen to fit the Missing 411 profile. In our first episode on the Pennsylvania cluster, we covered about 13 of them, specifically those which, while odd on the face of things, did have likely very mundane explanations. These were primarily stories of children who were found just a mile or two from home, those who said something odd but also on brand for a toddler about what happened to them, or those who simply encountered natural tragedies as a result of poor decision-making by either the child or the parents. However, as I said, there were just 13 of 39 that could be so easily explained, leaving 26 that don't seem to fit the bill of accident or simple wanderlust. The Bachman story is the earliest of them, taking place in 1883, and while Paulides' account differs slightly from what the newspapers reported at the time, it doesn't necessarily do so to any significant degree. Sources such as the Carlisle Sentinel and the Lebanon Daily News add the details that the family were out berry picking just 200 yards from the home, and that the dog did not just howl, but rather came to find John and his wife, despite having been tied to a tree prior to their setting off on the outing. Neither of these items suggest anything other than what Paulides has, that being that the Bachmans' youngest daughter was stolen from the home while her unwitting family stood within earshot. The difference lies in who, or what, was responsible for the disappearance. At first, it was thought that an animal had carried the little girl off, but that was quickly dismissed due to a lack of animal prints or other signs. Next, they considered a local Romani camp, but after a thorough search and a good amount of questioning, the sheriff ruled them out as well. By the 21st of June, 1883, 11 days after John reportedly discovered that his daughter was missing, the Philadelphia Times was reporting that neighbors of the Bachmans are becoming suspicious over the abduction, and even that some of them have gone so far as to declare that the Bachmans know more of the abduction than they care to tell. Neither John or his wife would say anything further to the press, which only bolstered the suspicion that they, not an animal or some cruel-intentioned intruder, were responsible. Paulides, however, doesn't share that opinion, and while he never explicitly says as much, his work leads to one inevitable conclusion. Something strange, potentially even supernatural, is responsible for these disappearances. But there's a disappearance that you could be responsible for, and that's the disappearance of your bad habits with today's sponsor, Fume. Fume is an award-winning flavored air device that is designed to help you kick your bad habits by replacing them with something that is not bad. You see, the hardest part of breaking a habit is the breaking the habit part. And Fume operates on the idea that rather than just trying to go cold turkey, you can take the thing that makes it a bad habit away and still continue doing the thing, thus tricking your brain into thinking that you haven't changed anything. And that's how they came up with this little guy, which is not a vape, it's not an e-cig, it is just flavored air. You can use it anywhere, there's no smoke, there's no vapor, it is not any sort of chemical going into your body, it is just air passing over a little flavoring stick that is made out of natural fibers with natural flavoring. There's no nicotine or other chemicals, so there's no worry of addiction, and the non-toxic flavors offer a guilt-free alternative made with natural ingredients. And also, it's a nice little piece, you know? It looks very elegant. It's the kind of thing you would have put on your desk if you were an esteemed writer back in the early 20th century. Hemingway would have used one of these. Maybe. And also, if you have ADHD like me, and you like to, be able to move stuff around, it's nice and heavy, it's got a little fidgety thing. It's good times. So if you'd like to try Fume for yourself and see why it is that we have been promoting it for over a year now, you can head to tryfume.com, that is tryfum.com/lorelodge, or scan the QR code on your screen and use code LORELODGE at checkout to get your free Fume topper with your journey pack today. What's the topper, you might ask? It goes on the top. It's made of silicone. It makes it more comfy to use the thing. So, like I said, if you want to try Fume and you want a free Fume topper, go to tryfume.com/lorelodge or scan the QR code and use code LORELODGE at checkout. The highlands known as the Valley and Ridge Appalachians dominate much of central Pennsylvania, entering at the center of the state's southern border with Maryland and then exiting along the New York-New Jersey borders to the northeast. And one of the largest missing 411 clusters in Pennsylvania is centered around the eastern portion of that curve. Comprising 7 cases in and around the Pocono Plateau, the cluster includes 7 children between the ages of 4 months and 10 years, most of whom went missing between 1882 and 1915, with 2 outliers in 1940 and 1942. Of those cases, 2 were covered in the previous episode on the so-called Pennsylvania cluster, those being the Wolf and Kunchik disappearances. Both of these were, for all intents and purposes, completely solved cases in which both boys survived their ordeal. Not all cases in the Poconos ended so happily, however, nor were they also easily explained away. Wolf was a deaf and mute child who probably suffered from a stunted development due to a lack of proper care in the late 1800s, while 4-year-old Kunchik probably just got lost while playing in the woods. The cases of the Bachman girl, Mary Schultes, Augustus Staniker, James Glass, and Daisy Simpson, on the other hand, were both more confusing and much darker in their conclusions. You see, while the Poconos are widely known for their beautiful hiking trails and many lakefront getaways, they weren't always so well manicured. Back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this was coal country, sparsely populated with poor infrastructure and little in the way of law enforcement. Outside of a few early resort towns, the people who lived there full-time were a mix of farmers, miners, and loggers, and outside of their immediate communities, they didn't have many people who could be counted on. Furthermore, ever-growing immigrant communities of Southern and Eastern European origin clashed with longtime inhabitants of largely Celtic and Germanic descent, and all of those groups were distrustful of the bands of Romani who wandered the valleys between the ridges. So, when 2 young children disappeared from a little mining village called Hazel Brook on April 21st, 1897, it was natural that suspicion fell along ethnic lines. Mary Schultes and Augustus Staniker were living in a small village called Hazel Brook, 2 miles west of Hazleton, writes Paulides, when the 2 children were playing behind their home and apparently wandered away and into the woods. According to the account in eastern United States, it didn't take long for the parents to realize that the 3- and 4-year-olds weren't where they were supposed to be, and the community of about a dozen households quickly got to work searching the surroundings. That wasn't easy going, considering that the surroundings in question were a swampy little valley with a mountain to the northeast. For days, the community worked hard to comb the nearby Appalachian ridges and everything in between, but they soon came to the conclusion that the children couldn't be in the area, and that meant they must have been abducted. That remained the leading theory through May and June, until on July 6th, a berry picker was on the mountain behind the residences in Hazel Brook, where he stumbled across an unfortunate scene of human remains. They were in an advanced state of decomposition, but there was very little doubt as to who they belonged to, leaving just one question, that being, how were they not found sooner? The area had been searched numerous times, and it wasn't particularly far away from where the children were last seen. Even more curious, as Paulides notes, is the fact that a little over 4 decades later, 4-year-old Rudy Kunchik would disappear in the same general area, though he was eventually found. The Schultes and Staniker families obviously couldn't have known that, but it's still a strange coincidence, right? Well, not exactly. There are a few pieces of the story that don't quite fit with the reported reality. First of all, Hazel Brook was not 2 miles west of Hazleton, but rather about 5 miles east. Additionally, it took quite a while for their disappearance to be noticed. The Standard Speaker reported on April 23, 1897, that the children left their homes on Wednesday morning to play, but when evening arrived and they failed to return, their parents became alarmed. It also took just 1 day for their fathers, reportedly named Andrew Skirty and John Storkey, to conclude that they must have been kidnapped. Apparently, a group of Italians who lived in the community had departed that same day, intending to return to Italy, and there was concern that they brought the children along with them. Why a group of Italians would kidnap some random Hungarian kids isn't explained, but one possibility is that they intended to sell the children off, which sadly was not nearly as uncommon as you'd like to think. Or it could have just been ethnic tension between 2 immigrant groups causing suspicion. Either way, the conclusion was as Paulides described it. The children were found on the mountain just north of the community, where they were believed to have perished of starvation and exposure. And on this one, I kind of have to agree that something about that seems strange. If the children were that close, and we're talking like half a mile from the village to the peak of this ridge, then they should have heard people calling for them as they worked their way up the mountain. The elevation change isn't particularly steep, about 200 feet over that half mile, and while it might be hard to hear voices across that distance, the Standard Speaker reported that they were also using whistles. As someone familiar with Pennsylvania's mountains, it just doesn't sit right with me that they wouldn't have heard the searchers looking for them, or really that the place they were found could have been so easily missed while they were alive. You know, I've spent a lot of time in the Poconos, and I've also spent a good amount of time down in the Smokies, and while I'm not saying that the Poconos can't be dense by any stretch, it's not the same. It's not quite the jungle that you're getting down there. So it would seem that something is missing from this story. Adding to the mystery is the fact that 18 years after the Hazel Brook incident, though in all fairness on the other side of the Poconos, 4-year-old James Glass also disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The Glass family were staying in the little town of Greeley, which, oddly enough, apparently originated as something of a Brisbaneist Marxist commune owned by the Sylvania Association, which even more oddly was supported by the New York Tribune founder Horace Greeley, who served as the association's treasurer until it collapsed in 1845. According to a Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission sign on nearby Route 434, they somehow lost all of their crops to frost in July. Whether or not it was frost or simply inexperience that led to the crop failure is disputed, but either way, the area had evolved into a normal Pennsylvania hamlet by the early 1900s. In any case, Charles Glass took his family out to Greeley in May of 1915, and on the 12th of that month, his son Jimmy went along with his mother as she walked to the post office. According to Paulides, the post office was just 300 feet from their summer home, which, if the post office hasn't moved, means they were basically across the street or down a little road that's to the west of the corner where the post office sits. It would seem that Mr. Glass had an eye on his son until he went behind a tree and was obscured from view, and by the time his mom turned around to head back from the post office, he was gone. Somehow, in the few seconds it took for Mrs. Glass to deposit letters into the mailbox, Jimmy simply vanished. Searches turned up nothing, even with the backing of Charles Glass's not insignificant resources, and at one point, he even put out a $1,000 reward for information leading to the location of his son, whom he had immediately believed kidnapped, which in 1915 was equivalent to over $31,000. Still, continuous searches turned up even more nothing, and it wasn't until 8 years later that any trace of Jimmy could be found. A hunter was in the wilds of Pike County, Pennsylvania, writes Paulides, when he found a small skeleton in the middle of a swamp among a thorn thicket. Citing the Toledo Blade for December 6th of 1923, Paulides added that in the aftermath of the discovery, the father reiterated his belief that the boy did not wander away and die of starvation, as Pennsylvania authorities believe. Jimmy was either murdered by kidnappers or died of exposure, and his body was thrown into the swamp. Now, once again, I am puzzled by David's choice of sources, considering there was an article in the much closer Wilkes-Barre Times-Leader 3 days prior to the one he used, but at this point, I'm not particularly surprised. Anyway, the Times-Leader provided a pretty exhaustive report on the discovery, which occurred at the foot of a rock in a thick woods 2 miles from the spot he was last seen, where the paper reported that searchers must have, at times, passed within a few feet of where the body lay. The hunter in question was local business owner Otto Winkler, who noticed a skull and a pair of children's shoes and immediately reported it back to the police. The paper either did an immaculate job of reporting on the exact words of Mr. Glass and Mr. Winkler when the father was shown the skull and shoes, or the reporter just made it up, but the exchange was as follows. When they arrived at Winkler's home, Captain Rooney looked at the skull, examined the shoes, which answered the description of those which Jimmy wore, and said, "There is no doubt about it, this is the boy." The father was not so sure. "It looks bad," he stammered, "but how can I be certain?" A group of deer hunters stood nearby. One asked him if it wouldn't be a relief, after all the years of uncertainty, to know something definite, even if it meant admitting his son was dead. "I understand what you mean," said Mr. Glass, "but I can't look at it that way. I've always hoped." Winkler interrupted. "Come," he said, "maybe we'll find more." Now, the trek to the site of the remains only added to the strangeness of the whole affair, as Winkler led the way to the rear of the house and struck into a dense woods in which the undergrowth was so thick that at times those in front had to break their way through. While terrain can certainly change in 8 years, it doesn't seem likely that the rural northeastern Pennsylvania wilderness in an underdeveloped area like Greeley would have become more difficult to trek through over that time span, making it seem even more unlikely that Jimmy had wandered over there of his own free will. Once they did arrive, though, they quickly uncovered the rest of the remains, in fact, almost an entire skeleton. The only significant missing pieces were the jawbone and hands, but that wasn't the strange part. Animals could have scavenged those, or potentially the bones could have disintegrated on their own. No, what was peculiar was the position of the body, which they determined would have been on his side with his feet drawn up, or in other words, the fetal position. If he'd been kidnapped, harmed, and then dumped there, he should have been flat, splayed, or otherwise situated. The fetal position, on the other hand, is typically indicative of somebody who died in that spot, rather than somebody who was moved, with the exception of a rather caring and deliberate burial, which it did not appear this was. Combined with the remote location of this site, it simply doesn't line up with a kidnapping gone wrong, and the authorities agreed. To Sheriff Ernest C. Wood, Coroner J. Henry Ludwig, and coroner's physician Dr. John G. Ross, it appeared that the child met his fate as a result of exposure and exhaustion after becoming lost in the woods. The only problem was, nobody could figure out how he managed to get lost. According to the leader, the remains were located approximately 2 miles in a straight line from where Jimmy was last seen alive, but separated from there by a small mountain. Granted, the highest points in that radius are less than 200 feet above the little strip of homes that makes up Greeley, but they're still densely forested and crisscrossed by streams in every direction. Based on information in the Carbondale Daily News for the same date, it seems likely that the remains were found in the area of Grassy Brook, which sits to the northeast of Greeley over a wooded hill. But if that's the case, though really whether or not that's the case looking at a map of the area, then how did Jimmy manage to go missing within view of his own mother and between the post office and his own home? Well, Paulides didn't exactly describe the situation properly. According to the Wilkes-Barre Leader for the 18th of May 1915, just 6 days after Jimmy disappeared, the child toddled down the road from a house near there, bent on finding his mother, and his curly head was seen bobbing along the way by persons living on the road. Furthermore, the paper reported that he should have met his mother as she hurried back to the house, suggesting Jimmy didn't have all that many opportunities to get lost. But that's not the only description of events. According to the Scranton, PA-based Times Tribune, young Glass was last seen on May 12th playing in the yard at the home of Edwin Faust, with whom Mr. and Mrs. Glass and their family of 3 children were to spend the summer. Ignoring the part where Paulides missed the facts that Jimmy was not the only child and that the home did not belong to the Glass family, this is a much different story. Was Jimmy playing in the yard, or was he seen following his mother down the road? According to the same article, the mother called him to accompany her, but he shook his head, And 5 minutes later, the father called the boy, but there was no answer. Whatever the case, one of the only investigative details I could find was that bloodhounds were put on the scent and kept to the road between the farmhouse and the post office, stopping each time and barking at a certain hedge. This apparently led to the belief that the child had been picked up by somebody in a vehicle, which of course would suggest a kidnapping. On the other hand, the coroner determined that he wandered off and got lost. It's possible that Jimmy really did get lost in the woods, of course, and yet there is a degree of uncertainty to the whole thing. So I can't fault Paulides for seeing this, the Schultes-Staniker case, and to a lesser extent the Bachman story, and coming to the conclusion that they could be related. Then again, none of these stories necessitate anything truly inexplicable happening. The remains, in the 2 cases where they were found, were so decomposed that any soft tissue damage would have been unrecognizable. Their skeletons being found mostly intact would suggest they weren't dragged off by predators, at least of the animal variety, which leaves open the option that foul play was involved. Even if they truly did get lost, their size would explain the ability to traverse terrain that adults might find difficult, and their youth could account for their failure to recognize the danger in wandering away beyond the reach of their caretakers. With the limited reporting available, it's almost impossible to make any further assumptions about what could have happened, so we're stuck wondering if these were just bizarre accidents or if something more sinister was at work. For example, looking at specifically the Glass case, we only get, distances. We don't get any directions. There's no, the house was west of the post office and he was found east. And if he was found near Grassy Brook, he would have had to have crossed the main road through Greeley to make it all the way over there. And he'd have to have traversed a mountain. But if he was west, well, then it's a little bit more easy to understand how he got lost. Without those details, we really can't say. And that's kind of how all 3 of those cases go. Maybe there's unreported details that kind of explain how this happened. But then there's the possibility that those details weren't reported because nobody had them. And if that's the case, then it seems like something very strange could have happened. We just don't know. And then there's the case of Daisy Simpson. At just 1 paragraph, the entry for the story of Daisy Simpson is one of the shortest in the entirety of Missing 411 Eastern United States. And yet out of all the Pennsylvania cases involving children, it may just be the weirdest one there is. Aiden, the David Paulides mood lighting. Thank you. This is another case in which the article did not give the first name of the missing child, Paulides writes. The May 28, 1901 New York Times article merely stated that the missing girl was the daughter of Frank Simpson. The article states the girl was playing with family members when she walked into the woods for some unknown reason. The children tried to lure her out, but she disappeared. The family summoned neighbors and friends to search the woods but could not find the girl. I could not find any other articles about this incident, but there was one sentence in the article I found that was disturbing. Is believed to have been carried off by a bear in the woods near here. There is no explanation why the family believes the child was taken by a bear. Now, you may think the bear part is odd, as David apparently did, but in fact, that's one of the easiest parts to explain. If he hadn't stopped looking as soon as he found something that might suggest Bigfoot was involved, he'd have found that not only were there multiple other articles about the disappearance, but several of them mentioned that a bear had been killing sheep in the area for weeks. These included a May 29th article in the Scranton Times, a May 30th one in the Harrisburg Telegraph, and at least one other from the same date in the Philadelphia Times. No, the genuinely peculiar parts are all the things that David Paulides completely failed to mention because he didn't bother checking any Pennsylvania papers. So far as I can tell, the disappearance was first reported on the 29th, with at least 2 papers covering it, those being the Scranton-based Tribune and Times. The reports were simple, with little information beyond basic facts about the last known sighting and the search efforts so far. And while an exact location wasn't given, the reports confirmed that the Simpsons lived on the road from La Anna to Cresco and nearer to the latter community, and that Daisy was last seen playing with some other children on the side of the road. She reportedly wandered off into the brush sometime around noon on Monday the 27th, and after 2 days of searching, nobody was able to find hide nor hair of the girl. Based on that information, we know the disappearance happened somewhere along PA Route 191, which has an 8-mile stretch of basically nothing at all but forest between the 2 aforementioned places. For the next several days, that is basically all anyone could write about the incident. The York Gazette reported that several hundred residents of Cresco were searching for her, but with the caveat that she was believed to have been carried off by a bear in the woods nearby. Still, there was a chance she could have been lost out there, and nobody wanted to give up while there remained a possibility that she could be found alive. So, they searched. They searched 1.5 miles to either side of the road, up cliff faces and down creek drainages, and yet there was no sign of the missing 3-year-old. It was only on the 31st, a Thursday, that someone finally stumbled across the child, who was unfortunately deceased. A man by the name of Hogenscheller reads a June 1st article in the Scranton Tribune, who lives on the Pocono Heights farm after leaving a search party of about 125 people on his way home, came to the body at a distance of 3 miles from her home. And this is where things started to become really, really strange. While it's never made particularly clear where the body was eventually located, we can infer a few things from that description. It doesn't help that the articles can't decide whether the Simpsons lived in Coolbaugh Township or Barrett Township, but the farm in question was probably a property now known as Pocono Mountain Farms, which sits about 1.5 miles northeast of La Anna and a little under 7 miles north of Cresco. There are 2 roads which connect the property to those communities, and while it took me 8 years to track down a map that appears to confirm the existence of the more direct route, it does appear to exist. Since it's absurdly unlikely that this Hogenscheller fellow was walking due north through densely forested, cliff-riddled mountains, he probably was taking the road. And that means that the body was very close to the road. It gets even weirder because, according to the Scranton Tribune, Daisy lay near a log, face upward, eyes open, and the condition of her body indicated that she had perished the first night she had been out. Those 2 things put together would suggest that as over 100 people searched the area around the road for a full 3 days, Daisy was in plain view, and yet nobody managed to find her. Not only that, but the Scranton Times reported that the little one had probably died from fright, grief, and exposure on the first night she was out, which is an odd thing to say considering the following sentence reads, "The body lay beside a log and the disturbed condition of the soil about her indicated she had gone through a terrible ordeal in her fright." The Tribune clarified what that meant, specifically that there was evidence of a struggle before life had left the body, as there were holes in the ground at the child's feet. And based on the reports, there were no signs of physical trauma, so whatever would have scared her to death must not have touched her either. To condense all of that down into a simple little package, the conclusion of the authorities was that Daisy wandered off into the woods, found the road again, walked 3 miles from her home, somehow died so suddenly that her eyes didn't even close, while also having time to struggle against, well, nothing, to such a degree that she left holes in the dirt at her feet, all on the first night of her disappearance, and on top of that, nobody saw the body for a full 3 days, despite it being right alongside the main road between La Anna and Cresco. Aside from all of that, I am utterly stunned that arguably the most inexplicable missing child case in the entire Pennsylvania cluster got exactly 1 paragraph, and that it didn't even include her very easily accessible first name. To be quite honest, I haven't the faintest clue what happened to Daisy. The only natural explanation I could come up with is that she wandered off, ended up finding the road, but followed it the wrong direction, and perhaps had a fatal seizure in the place where she was found. However, that still doesn't explain how she remained unseen for 3 days while lying along a road where people were actively searching for her. Maybe there's a reporting error, but based on what little documentation we have, I really can't wrap my head around this one. Even if she had been kidnapped, or if something happened in the woods and someone or something placed her there, it doesn't account for those signs of a struggle in the dirt at her feet. A younger me would have suggested that it was something paranormal, and while the older, more skeptical me hates to admit it, that seems to be the best possible explanation given the available information. And that conclusion is one that I think lines up with what Paulides has been aiming for since he released the very first Missing 411 book back in 2011. As I've said in the past, I fully believe that David Paulides wants you to believe that Bigfoot is responsible for these disappearances. Or at least that's what he wanted people to believe back then. In the intervening years, the argument has seemingly changed somewhat, with his most recent release being the UFO connection, but the origin point very much seems to have been Sasquatch. I've gotten quite a bit of flack from Paulides devotees in the past over that claim, and oftentimes from people who don't realize that I was once just like them. I really believed what David Paulides was saying. Oddly enough, these same people criticizing me for pointing that out are often the ones most emphatically insisting that these cases aren't explainable and that something is being hidden from us. But what? What is being hidden? I think David made that perfectly clear in his work. If you look at the intro to Eastern United States, he tells the story of how Missing 411 came to be. I was originally led to this story by an off-duty ranger at a national park I was visiting, he writes, continuing on to say that they informed me of a series of missing persons cases at the parks that were not getting any visibility in the press. What isn't written there, and probably because people would scoff, is that he wasn't just visiting that park. You see, in the intro to the sister book, Missing 411 Western United States, he explains that story in more detail. It wasn't just that some ranger recognized him and approached him to bring this up out of the blue. No, he was, as he writes, asking a series of questions to a law enforcement supervisor, and the conversation soon got around the park that I was making inquiries into specific topics that caused a great deal of conversation among the park's employees. Those specific topics, as it happens, were very much related to his work with North America Bigfoot Search, an organization founded and directed by Paulides himself. He goes on to say that the ranger introduced himself and stated that he had read my books, these being books about Bigfoot, and said that he knew of my law enforcement and investigative background and felt that I was the perfect individual to research an issue that he had known concerned him for many years. Now, I have no interest in slandering David Paulides. It may very well be that a ranger recognized him from these prior books on Bigfoot, as he said. It's just that if they approached him for that reason, then it's a little silly to say that Missing 411 has nothing to do with Bigfoot, especially when you consider the fact that the Missing 411 books and movies are all listed over on the North America Bigfoot Search website. The connection is also written all over the pages of each book. In Daisy's story, for example, he points out the issue of the belief that a bear took her, wrongly claiming that there was no explanation of why a bear was suggested in the first place. Frequently, when discussing bears, he makes a point to argue that the behavior doesn't match with a bear, or how the area doesn't have bears, or how a child described being cared for by a bear. It's not the bears that are the issue, but rather the disbelief that it could have been a bear that belies the reality of his arguments. The whole idea is that something large and hairy is being described, and what else is large and hairy? Sometimes it's not bears though, but instead it's wild men. Mentioning these feral-looking people roaming about the parks who are somehow completely elusive of law enforcement is, in my opinion, an attempt to bring you around to the particular conclusion that Sasquatch is involved in the disappearance. And if not Sasquatch, then at the very least he's suggesting it's something paranormal or worth being covered up by the Park Service, which is another claim made in the introduction to Western United States. He even writes that he is purposely excluding the gender and park where the ranger was working in an effort to conceal the ranger's identity, even though he used the male pronoun throughout the anecdote. And then he hammers onto the conspiracy aspect by saying that we never had another conversation after that, but I did leave my email address in case the ranger wanted to forward any further information. He closes that thought out with the ominous statement, "I never heard from the ranger again." Like I said, I have no interest in slandering the man, but I think we need to be honest about what the claim behind Missing 411 really is. As a believer in the paranormal myself, and as someone who really does think there's something to all of this Bigfoot stuff, it pains me to see what has to be either dishonesty or shoddy research gain such a strong following in pop culture. It's hard enough to say, no, I don't think Bigfoot is a total myth as it is. It's much harder to get people to listen to you when the first thing they think of is something like Missing 411, which has only become more and more controversial as it has gained more notoriety. Beyond that, it's unfair to the families of the missing to use these stories as evidence, or worse, to just sell books. That's not to say that David Paulides shouldn't write or research. I wouldn't have a career if he didn't. And what I mean to say by that is that when I started off with YouTube, I was trying to help prove him right. I was trying to make a channel that supported his claims and backed them up with evidence coming from my position as a historian. But as I've gone through more and more of them, I have found that more often than not, in fact probably 9 out of 10 times, the evidence just doesn't support his conclusion. Still, these are often interesting stories, and they usually come with a teachable moment about what to not do in the woods. And it also gives me an opportunity to correct the record and do something of a peer review regarding Paulides' work. And coming from an academic background in history, peer review is just the standard. You really don't get anybody to take you seriously unless you go through that process. I want to be clear that I'm not doing this to rag on David Paulides or to tarnish his reputation. It's just important that if there's going to be stories floating around out there, there is a resource where you can get the most factually accurate version of it. That's not to say I get everything right every single time, but you could do more due diligence than he does. I guess what I'm saying is that I wish he would pay a little bit more mind to these stories and pare down his coverage to the ones that really do defy any and all logic, instead of painting with such a broad brush. There are enough weird examples to cover without dipping into those with legitimate explanations. And in the next episode in this series, I plan to cover 2 of them. So if you want to support our work of supplying high-quality, fact-based information on unsolved mysteries, conspiracy theories, all the like, you can subscribe to us on Patreon. It is just $1 a month, and it gets you access to some exclusive stuff, but more importantly, helps us to improve the show. We also recommend checking out our Discord. The link is in the description, or you can go to bit.ly/jointhelodge. That is where all of the updates come out. It's where you can have conversations with other members of the community. We have a tip line where you can suggest cases for us to look at. It's a good place to be. Also, we hop in there sometimes and we'll play video games or just chat with you guys. You can also check out our live show, which is Monday nights at 7 p.m. It's just kind of a casual discussion-based program where we sit and chat about whatever it is we've been covering lately. And if you check out the Patreon, you get Liquored Lore, which is that with liquor. And if you're looking to get more Lodge, you can check out our other channels like History Unhinged, which is a podcast we do with Stephen Bell from History of Everything. And it's exactly what it would sound like. It's 2 historians and that guy sitting down and talking about crazy stuff that happened. And then we have that same exact kind of show, but with Wendigoon, and it's about the Bible. If you want to support us in a more direct way, you can also get our merch from Bunker Branding. It looks like this, and then there are also designs that don't. You can also get our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk, from Tableau Roasting Company down in Kentucky. I designed it myself. It's very tasty. Please enjoy it. Also, if you're seeing this on the Friday it came out, there's a good chance I'm streaming video games on my channel, The Aiden Mattis, tonight. If you're not watching this on the Friday it came out, then, well, the next Friday I'm probably doing it. We used to do these as premieres, and then you guys didn't like that, so now I can't just redirect you over to my own show. So I have to do it manually. I have to be like, please give me views. Okay, I think that's everything. Bye now. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.